Welcome to this week's episode of In Therapy. Over the next few weeks, we're going to do something a little bit different. In early January, we're going to meet our next new participant for In Therapy. But in the meantime, we wanted to explore some things that have been requested by you, the audience. The first is people have been asking questions about the story behind In Therapy. How did it start? How do we find the people? What's the process that people go through to be selected for the series? And also people have been asking about what's it like working on the series. So in this week's episode, I'm going to share some of the answers to those questions. In next week's episode, we're going to be exploring some of the key themes within Hayley's story. I'll also be answering some of your questions from those episodes. Then in the first episode at the start of January, we're going to be talking about some of my latest work about frameworks and models for understanding trauma. And at the end of that episode, we're going to meet our next new participant. So how did the original idea for In Therapy come about? So around 4 or 5 years ago, I was really sitting with two reflections. The first was that I was loving watching videos on YouTube, and there were particular subjects and areas, some slightly random, one which was watching videos on parkour and free running, which I have no interest in doing and no capacity to do, but I found myself going down these rabbit holes of content and creators on YouTube. But the second thing was realizing that my great love and passion doing one-on-one therapeutic work with people was not represented on that platform. And I found myself wondering, well, why was that? Was that because someone had tried it and it hadn't worked? Was it that it wasn't a good idea? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that when we are in the company or witnessing of someone going through a transformational journey, we can't help but be touched and impacted by it. And often things change in ourselves watching and hearing about other people's stories. For example, when I do demos as part of our therapeutic coaching practitioner training for our practitioners that are in training, people in the room will share after a demo how something shifted or something was changing inside of them as a result of witnessing and watching that process. And so I found myself wondering, would there be a way to film people's therapeutic journeys and not just to demystify therapy and hopefully break down some of the barriers and invite more people into the potential of doing therapeutic work, but also directly impact people's own lives in the witnessing and the watching of those stories. So this was the seed of the idea. The next challenge was to find someone crazy enough to come and work on this project with me. And through a mutual friend, I was introduced to Oliver, who was the only person that I interviewed for the role. We had an immediate sort of connection and trust in each other and shared vision for the idea. And Oliver took the leap and gave up a proper job to come and work on In Therapy with me. And in the last first sort of 2.5 years from that point, we were experimenting and we were trying different ways of structuring episodes, different ways of finding participants, different ways of sort of structuring the amounts of kind of therapeutic work we would do. The early participants, it was a kind of open-ended, we would just sort of see how it went. And we learned a lot from doing that. And I think we're both proud of that early work. But like a lot of things, it takes time to really let something birth itself. And I often consider myself the most impatient person I know and the most patient person that I know. I'm impatient because I want things to move and I want things to happen. But I'm also patient in the sense that if something is really worth doing, it's worth doing properly and it's worth giving it the time and the space to really become clear and to unfold. And so around 6 months ago, Oliver and I were talking about, well, what is the next incarnation of In Therapy? Where, from everything we'd learnt over the kind of first few years of doing it and our own interest and our own curiosity of where to go next, the ideas that particularly Oliver brought forward were what really you've seen in the episodes with Hayley. So the things that we changed were we are following one story from beginning to end as a season, rather than different people's stories kind of coming in and coming out. And what that allows people to do is to really follow the story as it's happening. Even though we're filming 1 to 2 months ahead, it means that we're doing weekly sessions that people are following weekly. Also, we have started adding in the commentary and the guidance of what's happening. And that was particularly informed by Oliver's love of podcasts and really well-produced documentary-style podcasts. And that's been really interesting for me as well, because it's forced me to really think about what I'm doing in the sessions when in reality, I'm just following, for want of a better way of putting it, following my nose in the moment. Like what feels like or what instinctively is the next right thing to do. It's always interesting for me when we're training practitioners that we obviously have a very detailed methodology and process and protocols and ways of working. But in reality, like anything in life, when you get to a certain level of experience, you're then just, in a sense, instinctively following what's happening in that moment. And so it's been interesting for me to break that down in the commentary of actually this is what's happening and this is why we're doing it and this is what's going on and how we're working with it. So that seems to have been another piece that has been popular and has helped people to follow more closely the stories. Another thing that we've been doing different this series is we've been following the participants more behind the scenes. So most weeks between sessions, Oliver and Jeremiah go and visit the participants and ask them a little bit about how it's impacted them, where they're at. And I think that's also added another really interesting dimension that, in a sense, we get one aspect in the therapy room, but also how things land, and also for participants to be able to talk to someone that's not me, the practitioner, about what's really going on for them. And so that feels like it's just brought another dimension to the process that I think has made it more accessible for the audience. It's also been really interesting for me to have a sense of how sessions are landing beyond just what happens in the session. The other thing that we changed is we recognized that although we've loved working with everyone that's been part of In Therapy, that people coming from within the ecosystem of my own body of work meant that people would often come in with certain foundational knowledge that was already there, which could make it sometimes tricky for people in the audience to have a sense of that early stages of either therapy or the early stage of someone coming into my work. And so we decided to work with a professional casting person like you would do in TV. And we had some hesitancies about that, as you can imagine, because the last thing we want is people that are wanting just to be on camera for the sake of being on camera, as opposed to wanting to do real therapeutic work and being willing for that to be filmed. But we found a guy called Matt, and Matt has been amazing to work with, has done an outstanding job of finding Hayley and the next person that you're going to meet in a few weeks' time, and has been through an incredibly thorough process to find those people. Everything from posts on social media to we had an advert played on local radio to Matt doing street casting in places like Walthamstow and Camden in London, handing out hundreds of flyers and going into local shops and community centres and so on, trying everything possible to get the word out. And when he did this, when we went through several processes of this, we get lots and lots of inquiries, but then really finding the right people that have a diversity of story, that really want to be doing it for the right reasons, that we feel are psychologically stable enough and suitable to go through a process like this. And then so we sort of see the intake as two parts. It's finding the people And then it's the vetting process, which is also very thorough, that they talk to Matt, they then talk to Oliver, they then have an independent psychological assessment via a psychologist. We review all of the footage, they do questionnaires. So we really try to make sure that they're doing it for the right reasons and that they're the right people for the series. And I know this is something that people have asked questions about on YouTube around, well, what's the ethics of filming someone's therapeutic process? And from my perspective, it all comes down to what are someone's reasons and motivations? What's the impact, the likely impact of being part of the process for them? And how is the story handled? And there's a great deal of trust that gets built in the therapeutic work that we do together. And we've had a number of people that have started filming, and either they've requested to stop, or we've had a conversation said, like, this doesn't feel like you feel entirely comfortable in this process, and we've stopped. And so by definition of you seeing a story, it's because we've been through a very thorough process. We've started filming, we've seen how it's gone, and we and they have had a real comfort and confidence in what we're doing and why we're doing it. But that also makes it really, really challenging to find people, and particularly for us, it's really important to have a diversity of people that represent different backgrounds and different experiences, and that's part of what we're particularly excited to be bringing to the next steps and stages of the series. So in this new format, part of what was really interesting for me was going back to doing weekly sessions with people. That this is not something that I've done with clients for a number of years. And generally speaking, how I've normally worked is seeing people alternate weeks initially, then every 3 weeks, or every 4 weeks. And so that was different for me to have weekly sessions with somebody where we could really go deeper in that focus and in that time. And generally what it turns out to be is 8 or 9 sessions over around 12 or 13 weeks, because I might be away, or the participant might be away, or one of the Oliver or Jeremiah might be away. But roughly it's most weeks in a sequence. And I've really enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that's meant, that we've been able to really keep the focus on that therapeutic work. And with the homework that I set people, particularly watching modules from the Reset program, it really gives some momentum and some intensity in a positive way to that process. And one of the things that's been particularly interesting in Hayley's story has been the impact of you guys, the audience. Because historically, we would be putting out different participants at different points, and because there wasn't quite the same momentum behind it, there wasn't the same level of comments and interaction from the audience. But we started releasing Hayley's episodes around, I think, session 6 or so of her filming, which meant that she was starting to read those comments. And in fact, in last week's episode, I read some of those comments to her on camera. And it was particularly interesting in Hayley's story because this key theme around the negative impact of her mum, and how her mum had, in a sense, been internalized and merged with her inner critic. And so a lot of the work that we did together was getting some separation from that, getting some awareness around that, learning to defend against it, also putting boundaries in place with her mum. But the momentum of the history had a lot of volume and had a lot of impact on her. So I was challenging that, and she was very open to my challenge and really wanting to see things differently. But that old voice was loud. And so to then read the comments from you guys, the audience, helped amplify this new identity really that was forming inside of her, and giving a holding and a support towards that. And that was, for me as a practitioner, fascinating to see the impact of that. And going back to my earlier example around teaching on our practitioner trainings and seeing the impact of people being witnessed, it was really something to be able to have you guys watch in the privacy of your own homes, or listening, or you're commuting to work on a podcast, but then feeding back, and then that actually supporting the therapeutic process. Now, of course, every participant's different and not every participant's going to want to necessarily read comments. I know some haven't even watched their episodes. But what was also interesting was that sometimes it was quite overwhelming for Hayley in the room to take on board everything that I was saying. And I know that for her to be able to re-watch the sessions, she said to me that she's heard things that she hadn't heard the first time, or things had landed in a way they hadn't landed the first time as well. It's been a very beautiful confirmation of the intentions and the hopes behind the series. Ultimately, this series is a living, evolving thing, and I'm very curious as to where the series is in a few years' time as it continues to develop and evolve. I'm also really excited by the participants we bring in. I can't wait for you guys to meet the latest person we've been filming with. A very different story to Hayley's in some ways, but of course, similar elements and aspects as well. So I hope this has been interesting. I'd love to hear your reflections and your questions about this. In next week's episode, I'm going to be exploring some of the key themes within Hayley's 9 sessions. I'm also going to be answering some of your questions. Each week on In Therapy, I've been doing a bonus video to help you go deeper into some of the key principles and particularly to make them relevant to your experience, and providing a worksheet for reflections. By the way, you can get access to all of those for free at intherapy.alexhoward.com. But those that have been following those bonus resources have been asking some questions, and I'm going to be answering those as well in next week's episode. I look forward to talking with you then.